Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Deborah Pyron, the stage captain here for First Baptist Stage, and it's delighted that you all have joined us for this session. Just a couple of brief announcements, and then we'll get started with the presentation. First, I would let you know that Martin Padgett will be signing books at the conclusion of this session. That will take place in the signing tent. When you exit the sanctuary, it will be out to your left, but there will be volunteers directing you to that location. There will be no Q&A at the conclusion. Booksellers are stationed out around the front lawn and are available for purchase. Tall Tale Books is the book-selling sponsor for this particular session, and if you've not already purchased a book, or if you've done so and now decide that you want to purchase additional books, they will be delighted to help you with that sale. The Decatur Book Festival is a nonprofit, and we depend on sponsors and donations from supporters and book lovers like yourselves to help us continue to bring authors to Decatur each year. When you came in, I hope you picked up one of these little bookmarks. If you didn't, they are available on your way out. They have a QR code on the back that you can simply scan, and that will take you directly to the DBF donation site, or you can go online to the festival webpage, which is www.decaturbookfestival.com. Now, if you will just take a moment and pull out that cell phone or any other device that's going to have a ringtone so that we can have a non-interrupted session for the next 45 minutes. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the participants for our next session here. Moderator for this session is Jeremy Redmon. Jeremy is a journalist, essayist, and educator with more than 27 years of experience reporting for newspapers. He writes for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and teaches journalism at Kennesaw State University. Jeremy will be in conversation with Martin Padgett. Martin has written books, features, product reviews, and news for 30 years. He has an MFA from the University of Georgia Grady College of Journalism and received a 2019 Lambda Literary Fellowship. He's written for Oxford American, Gravy, Details, and Business Week. Please welcome our next session.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I was told I was supposed to hold the microphone like this.
Yeah, you're way around.
Good to see you all. Thank you for coming out today. I want to talk a little bit about Marty before we get started. It's my honor to introduce him for the second time. I first met Marty as a fellow student in the University of Georgia's Master of Fine Arts program in narrative nonfiction writing. And I was the freshman coming in, and I remember just how kind he was in showing me the ropes and not hazing me. He was very kind, but I remember him working extraordinarily hard on his book at the time, and that hard work shows in the covers of his very fine narrative, in the reporting and in the writing. And you've gone over Marty's credentials, but I want to highlight a few things about him. That he's a Lambda Literary Fellow. His work has appeared in some really nice publications, the Washington Post among them, Bitter Southerner, Oxford American. He's pursuing a PhD in history at Georgia State University. But most importantly, Marty is a good human being, and I'm glad to call him a friend. Marty, I want to turn it over to you. You had a few things I think you wanted to emphasize or to point out and to recognize.
Definitely, both of us want to say hi to all the UGA alumni that are here with us, down to journalism school and mentors and everybody. And I also wanted to let people know that a few of the people who I depended upon to tell the story are here in the audience, and in particular, a couple of people, Dave Hayward and Eric Solomon, are working on a set of online tours, self-guided tours that you can take to visit some of the places that are important to queer history in Atlanta. And that used to be an in-person thing, and COVID, of course, required a translation of that to online, and hopefully soon in the future it'll be both. But as of October 15th, thanks to the Georgia Humanities Council, you'll be able to do self-guided tours of your own, thanks to their hard work. So, great to hear during LGBTQ History Month.
Thank you, Marty. Let's start where I can imagine a lot of people have a question like I did, is can you tell us a little bit about how Frank Powell came up with the name for his club, the Sweet Gumhead, also known as the Showplace of the South? So where did the name come from?
Frank was from the Florida Panhandle, where I'm kind of a part-time resident now, more than part-time. Sweet Gumhead is barely a dot on the map, and it really didn't even exist when it was put on the map in the 30s. There was some political lobbying. It's really just a stream that feeds into the Choctawhatchee River, and the actual town itself was just a collection of farm households. They didn't even have a school in the town. It was where Frank was from. And I found it very touching early on to find out that this wasn't some salacious name or some euphemism, that it was his hometown. It was very touching to me. And he had already opened a couple of other bars before that. So when I understood that, I understood there's a little something different about this place.
And so I'm interested to hear about the history of that building. We talked about this a little bit last night at dinner, what was there before, and some of the famous people who had performed there before it was the Sweet Gumhead. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Right. The building itself had been a supermarket in the 50s for the adjacent neighborhood, Lindbergh, Lindridge, Martin Manor. But it became a nightclub space in the early 60s, and it was home to a few places that maybe some of you will recognize. Right before the Sweet Gumhead, it was a club called the Golden Horn, which had another larger club in town. Before that, it was Soul City, and it was part of James Brown's backup band. A couple who performed with James Brown opened it. He is said to have performed there during the first week, and they had a 4-year-old son who would dress up in a suit and play drums and dance, kind of at the peak of when Michael Jackson was at, the Jackson 5 were at their peak, 1970. Before that, it was the Cheshire Cat. It was a go-go bar, and Sonny and Cher played there for 4 months during a lull in their career, which, they barely had a lull with everything that they did from TV to recording to, so. Before that, it was a place called the Houndstooth, and that was the original owner who had laid down the red carpeting that persisted till the end of the club's day and had installed all the lighting and blew through $40,000 right away, never having owned or managed a nightclub, so don't do that.
And what is it today? What's going on there now? I understand maybe it's a strip club?
It's been a strip club on and off since the Gumhead closed in 1981. But, I drive by and try to see if there's anything going on, and COVID is, it's just decimated so many nightclub businesses. I have seen people outside of it, but of course Cheshire Bridge now doesn't have a Cheshire Bridge because that burned down, because that's how we roll here in Atlanta, I guess. But I feel the same way that Frank Powell at one point said that the neighborhood around him is suffering, and I lived on Cheshire Bridge Road, and to see it now with limited access, with a lot of the buildings abandoned because they were attached to nightlife, it's a little sad, and I cannot wait for the minute that things can open up again and be refilled with something new.
I'm curious too about the main characters in this book. So you tell the story through Bill Smith and John Greenwell. And I imagine like a bunch of other people in the room, when I was reading the book, this is my copy with all my notes in it here, I was hoping that they would meet at some point in the story, but they never do. And you told our mutual friend Philip Rafshun when he was interviewing you about your book that John believes he actually did meet Bill at one point. And you added that for John, his drag performances were a form of activism, and that for Bill, his activism was a form of drag. Can you elaborate on, to what extent they did meet and how they were different and the same in some ways?
Yeah, for one, I actually really enjoyed the fact that they never really met or never spent that much time together, because to me that created this third space, the space in between them, which was this nightclub. It was the physical place where the story happened, and that had a role in shaping the story and in shaping their lives. It wasn't until somebody pointed it out to me that this obverse relationship of Bill being the activist, but that was a kind of drag for him, and that John being a drag performer, and that was his activism. It took me a while to completely understand all the ramifications. To this day, when I talk to John Greenwell and say, this was a kind of a radical act of activism, he doesn't really believe it. He thought that real activists were protesting and that they couldn't do activism because when you get off work at 4 in the morning, the last thing you want to do is go downtown and march or post flyers or write articles. But he was on stage 6 days a week performing as a female personator, and more than that, the club was eventually hosting, organizing, and producing political events that would sustain the community. So that was a vital part of it, and without those early performances, the later performances and the later politics would not have happened.
I want to tease out a little bit about what we were just discussing, this idea that drag played a role in the queer civil rights movement. Could you comment on that a little bit?
In assimilation?
That drag plays a role in the civil rights movement for the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's this mediating presence. Drag is satire, and people who aren't LGBTQ can appreciate the humor and the star quality, and that in fact drew a lot of people to the club for reasons other than it was just kind of a queer clubhouse. It's a performance, and that has the ability to lure in people who would be allies, and this was a time where the queer community needed to create a lot of allies because they were going to need them in the decade to follow.
And now I'm fascinated by Bill Smith's character, and he accomplishes so much, as we talked about last night, that despite or because of the trauma that he endured, that he advocated for the rights of the LGBTQ community, organized protest gatherings, and running the bar. He also served, of course, as the second vice chairman of Atlanta's Community Relations Commission. At the same time, he's struggling with his identity. He's self-destructive. He's running a male escort service, and he's abusing drugs. So I'm curious how he's able to keep so many plates spinning at the same time.
That's the talent of people who are coping in ways other than, having to successfully confront all those issues, right? They're spinning the plates as fast as they can until they're not. In Bill's case, it seemed to be this relationship between always wanting to be an elected official and wanting to be at the very edge of political progress, and knowing that he couldn't do that because Atlanta wasn't San Francisco and it wasn't New York, and that was going to take a while longer for queer people to be viewed as being eligible for public office. It was a lot of tactical on-the-ground work for setting the stage for the queer rights movement to be visible and to have victories. So whether that was 100 people at the first protest or 400 people through the prides of 1976, 1977, or the 4,000 people who were protesting Anita Bryant, there was a lot of work that had to be done early, and he was one of the people who was doing that, and probably viewed it as essential to any success for civil rights.
And turning to John Greenwell, the other main character of this book, he does so much. He creates Rachel Wells, he rises to stardom, he leaves Rachel, he comes back to Rachel, and then he goes on to get a graduate degree in education. He moves back to Kentucky. He writes and produces plays and short stories. I understand that you were with him recently. Can you tell me how he's doing?
I had lunch with him on Thursday. He lives up in Kentucky, and we keep in touch. We've befriended each other, and we both have husbands named Jack. So we have many levels on which we relate. And I just happened to be up there for work, and said, "John, let's go out to lunch. I'll drive up," and he wouldn't let me pay. And when I got to lunch, he gave me a piece of stained glass, the shape of a sweet gum leaf that he had made for me, because I had been on Etsy and I found a sweet gum carved bowl to send to him, not knowing that the artist had named each of his pieces, and the piece on that bowl was Rachel. And this happens to me a lot when I'm researching, and I can't deny it. I just, the moments like these, they're signifiers for me. Yeah, I did the right thing, or yeah, I'm going in the right direction, and that to me was just validation.
It's really sweet. I'm interested too in the aspect of to what extent this is a memoir. You write about coming out yourself and buying a home on Cheshire Bridge Road next to the building that once housed the Sweet Gum Head. And you wrote, indeed, that this book is something of a memoir. Could you elaborate on that point? To what extent is it a memoir for you?
Yeah, I can answer that 100 different ways. And when I started writing it, I had no idea that it was actually a memoir. And I don't think I'll ever be a memoirist, because that's a skill and a depth of information about yourselves that I've never really captured on the fly. But realizing that both of them, Bill was a newspaper writer, and I'm a journalist, and John was his form of activism, and for some reason drag queens love me, and they come up to me and they touch my head and they just want to rub my head. I'm like, and I've always appreciated the art form and always been a big Drag Race fan, and I think it's more in this search for where we belong. And in both cases, they were almost in their 30s before they started to have some semblance of it. And, unfortunately, in Bill's case, it didn't lead to a healthy emotional state. But in John's case, certainly, he left Atlanta to go realize what the next part of his life was going to be about. And for him, it was a return home to where his mother lived, to where his favorite sister lived, and just knowing where you belong, if that's a place in your head or if it's a place on the ground.
Yeah, this is a book a lot about finding your identity. And you write that in many ways, John, Bill, and I have lived the same life in our search for the place we call home, in search of our true selves. To what extent did you all three find these things?
I ended up on Cheshire Bridge Road, living right next door to where the Sweet Gum Head was, so I think I found it accidentally. But it was also part of coming out late. I came out later in life, so like 27 years old, 28 years old. And I'm living in one of the most fertile gay communities on the face of planet Earth, right? Atlanta's always been the place where people from the South would come to. I'm from DC, but DC is kind of a transitional place, and it didn't have that kind of community, or that I knew of at the time. Atlanta was just this warm and welcoming place where I would come from living in Birmingham and drive out every weekend and always find somebody to talk to, always find a new restaurant to check out, always find a new nightclub to go to, even though I only ended up really going to like 2 of them regularly. It just seemed like this is something I've never experienced before as an adult, a mature and really vibrant queer community. And it was the thing that I needed to get the confidence that I needed to come out.
I love this line in your book, Marty, that you said that drag teaches us an important lesson. Sometimes to find out who you really are, we have to become someone else. How did you come to that realization?
I think I became someone else. I was the first person in my family to go to college and the first to leave home. And the fact that I went so far away from home gave me the ability to pick and choose who I thought I might want to be, and to pick and choose the visual trappings, the mental trappings, the emotional trappings of it all. And so I was talking with another one of our friends the other day, and I had this jacket on in a picture, and they noticed, they're like, wow, you've really gone full professor, huh? I was like, yeah, it's another form of drag, right? The glasses are more necessary than drag. Don't let me fool you on that. But certainly, you create something and then you fill the container of it. So I created an environment here in Atlanta where it would be easy to come out.
Your book is full of other great quotes. I love this one too. You're born naked and the rest is drag. So what does this mean?
What does it mean? It's RuPaul's catchphrase, and I had to unpack where it came from, and that was one of my favorite rabbit holes from the book, because it took me so long to figure out exactly the origins of it. And then somebody posted on Facebook about that phrase, and they said, oh, they think that he heard it from somebody at the Sweet Gum Head. So then I'm off on like a 5-day tear trying to figure it out, and somebody pointed out, listen to RuPaul's podcast. And he talked about it with Lady Bunny. And RuPaul had a roommate who had gone to the Sweet Gum Head and come back and was using that phrase. So he just adopted it and took it as his own. And it turns out it probably was from a performer named Mickey Day. And after I asked a few more other performers, they thought, yeah, that's probably it. That sounds like her. So nobody really knows 100% for sure, but there's definitely this linkage. And, you know, RuPaul had come to Atlanta in '76 with his sister and her husband and recreated himself too. And part of that legacy came from the Sweet Gumhead and other clubs along Cheshire Bridge Road.
You have a lot of really good rabbit holes I know you're excited about. One of them is music, right? And it plays such a critical role in your book. So in your piece, we read about This Is My Life by Shirley Bassey and Barry White's Love's Theme, and Gladys Knight's I got to use my imagination, and the Staple Singers' I'll Take You There, and of course Rock the Boat by the Hughes Corporation, and I can't leave out the Bee Gees. So I imagine you've written, or you could have written a whole book about this. Can you talk about that favorite rabbit hole of yours?
Yeah, do you have an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours? But some of my favorite things to write about were the songs, and I knew that would be a question for actually printing the book, because you can only use so much before you run into rights issues. How much of the lyric can you publish, and what can it be? It can't always be the hook or the chorus that people recognize automatically, but we kind of got away with that with the Hughes Corporation. Performers chose songs specifically because they had some emotional message to them, because they wanted to take that in and put it out there in the world. So, you know, when John Greenwell as Rachel Wells was performing a lot of songs by Karen Carpenter or Barbra Streisand, and Hot Chocolate was performing a lot of songs by disco performers and Patti LaBelle and the Pointer Sisters, you know, there was something that they were taking from those. So I started taking things from the songs while I was researching them, and you find out that, you know, disco is this much abused form of music that a lot of people got tired of very quickly. But there's such an artistry to it, and there's such a depth of musicianship and talent and performance and just innate musical brilliance and learned musical brilliance. And that's why the Barry White one is my favorite, because who else goes into a studio and lays out what's probably just going to be an outtake, and decides that that's the best thing, and then decides not to put Barry White's voice on the record? You have to be, you know, that is staggering musical genius to me, to say that I'm not in the forefront here. And I learned a lot with this, you know, I translated that directly. I'm like, I'm not the story here. I got a lot of pressure to make this memoir at several turns, because a lot of the publishing industry now is memoir, and it's not my story inherently. I allude to it in the beginning that, you know, kind of, it has that tone to it, but this is the story of these performers who are, you know, they're kind of dismissed as one-hit wonders. Well, let me tell you the whole story about how that song came about and how they hit the road in their car to drive 15 hours a time to promote that song, to get there. And it's just, disco as a genre is amazing for that, and for the way that we've kind of pushed it into the closet in history.
We talked about this last night, that it's not in the book, but you researched it, is I'm Coming Out.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not what Diana Ross thought it was, and when she found out what it was, what did she tell me?
And this is one of the things that, you know, book publishing, you get locked in at a certain day, and within the final 4 weeks of actually finishing this book, Nile Rodgers goes on TikTok to explain how he wrote the song with his writing partner, because they had seen drag queens performing at a show, and he wrote the song I'm Coming Out, and he was doing this album for Diana Ross. He was writing a bunch of the songs for her, producing it, so he gave that song to her, and she didn't realize the other aspect of what I'm Coming Out says. Like, I find that really hard to believe, because, you know, 20 years of recording brilliance, and now you just know that gay people do that. So apparently she got really upset, and Nile Rodgers is on TikTok saying how she was furious at him for giving her a song that alluded to this whole gay context to it. And, you know, maybe she feels differently about it now, but she was trying to establish her independence as a recording artist from Berry Gordy and from Motown, and she was afraid that this was going to damage that in some way. And that song immediately became like the mainstay of Pride celebrations everywhere. So there's no way you can't write about it, unless you get the timing wrong like I did. But we'll write about that in the future, because it's such a great story, and I want to talk to Nile Rodgers. So.
I have to admit, Joanna and I, when we were coming to have dinner with you, we were listening to Rock the Boat, so I apologize, but we had to do it. There's a point you make in the book as well about assimilation, and I'm interested to hear you talk about this. You write that while same-sex marriage has normalized aspects of our queer lives to a degree, Assimilation is one of many things that have eroded our sense of community. We're losing a distinct dimension of the queer experience. We're being straightwashed, even as an unashamed army of bigots wants to turn back the clock. Could you elaborate on what you mean by the dangers of assimilation?
The dangers are, you create a community and put a lot of work into defining what the community is, what it isn't, and to setting it apart. It has its own rights, it has its own rituals, it has its own constituency. And by acquiring the trappings of other cultures, you spend less time doing that. So we knew before COVID that gay bars were already diminishing in capacity and in numbers, in the number of people who are going to them. And now COVID, so that's accelerated that. So how are we reconstituting queer lives, relationships, communities, networks? Because this whole process of self-discovery is not just discovering ourselves as individuals, it's discovering that there's a whole world out there of queer people and that we have something in common that's to be celebrated and to be perpetuated. So gay marriage is one way that we've got the rights and respect and the civil rights that should be accorded to us, but all right, so now we have that. What about the things that we're still fighting for? What about all these Texas bills that are anti-trans? What about the very real threat now that the court will consider court cases that might reverse Obergefell, since they're considering one that will reverse Roe v. Wade right now? You have to be vigilant. And when you establish a community like this, it's always going to be fragile, and you always have to pay attention to it.
I'm interested, too, about how there's so many characters in this book, and I'm curious how you kept track of them, all of them. We have Burt Reynolds, makes an appearance. Of course, Jimmy Carter, who just celebrated a birthday. Maynard Jackson, and RuPaul. So how do you keep track of all these folks?
You want to know how many people I cut out? Oh. Because when I started to write the book, I thought, this takes place in a nightclub. There's no way that I can physically remove people from it other than to emphasize the stories that have the most resonance and ones that have these frequent connections that have meaningful ideas behind them. I have 3 or 4 or 5 vignettes that I wrote that just got pulled because I turned in 25,000 more words than I'd agreed to with my editor, and don't do that to your editor either, because then it's just it's a hard conversation and then it's a bunch of hard cuts. The most memorable one is I talked to Leslie Jordan, the actor, because he had been one of the people who came to the Sweet Gum Head, and he had also done drag in Tennessee, and he had tried to be on stage at the Sweet Gum Head, and he said I wasn't good enough to be. But when I got him on the phone, he talked for like 45 minutes, and he was laughing, and he was singing, and he was crying, and he was telling me that entire life story, and it was riveting. So I wrote it, and it was one that got pulled from the book, but I published it with The Bitter Southerner because that story by itself is just amazing. And of course, he's a natural storyteller. So he was able to amplify things that he had not written before in his books, or had not had, he hadn't had his Instagram fame yet when I spoke with him, but he just had this same resonant story told in his specific way, that he was running away from home to find out who he was going to be. And it took him another decade when he left Atlanta. He had several addictions and all kinds of other issues that he was dealing with, and he finally got clean, and that's when his acting career took off.
And I wonder, too, you did a number of interviews for this book. To what extent were you starstruck by any of the people you talked to? I think you interviewed Hot Chocolate?
Yeah, so Hot Chocolate, it's easy to get starstruck by Larry because he wanted to meet after his show, so he left me a ticket for the show, and it's on the Broadway Strip, or it was at the time. And we met in a casino at midnight, and everyone knows Hot Chocolate on the Strip, and we're sitting there doing an interview, and the slot machines are going off, and people are just kind of gawking their way by. And here I am just, never having met before. Just the sweetest, most charming person who had one of the more consistent careers at the club. He had moved to Texas a couple of times and back and forth, but it was also Miss Gay America 1979, 1980, so a vital part of the story, and close friends with John, so he was able to help me fill in some of the things that a person can't tell you about themselves. So he was this valuable sounding board plus just this fantastic story. I mean, Who else gets carried in on a sedan chair by 4 hot guys? I mean, other than me, right? You didn't see that part, but.
I'm interested too in the reporting of this and how, to what extent your identity helped you or hindered you in reporting on the LGBT community. Can you talk about that? You mentioned, what was the phrase you used last night? Pulling the pink card? Was that?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I think like interviewing Leslie Jordan, you can just pull the pink card and say, hey, I'm writing this story about this because it's queer history. So that level of access. I still don't have a great answer for you for that question, because I think by default, my sympathies are to write something that is, it elevates it. But anytime you're writing about a subject, you seek to elevate it in some way. So knowing that going in, it's all right. So the complexity of the story has to be down to the nth degree. What can I tell you about these people's lives that isn't just a story of celebrities or semi-celebrities or demi-celebrities interacting at this place? It's the fact that they had real family lives that they were engaging on some level, and that they were trying to cope with becoming queer and becoming adults at the same time. And it's the complexity that you always have to be unpacking. And I'm still hearing stories that I wish I could have added in, or other things that would have amplified other parts of the book. It's just, make people as round as you can on a page. And I think that is just as true for writing about queer community as it is for any other community.
I love the part too about the disco demolition night. What was that? And was, bigotry, homophobia part of what was happening as part of that event?
I think for the people whose records were blown up, they sure felt like that was a part of it. I'm sure a lot of people here know Disco Demolition Night was the summer of 1979. The Chicago White Sox and Detroit Tigers were having a doubleheader in Chicago, and they tried to promote the doubleheader by having people bring in disco records to blow them up on the grounds. It turned into a riot, and people were not necessarily badly injured, but it just got out of hand, and the police were trying to stem people in, and they were trying to flash messages on the board to people to take their seats, and eventually they had to cancel the second game of the doubleheader. But disco artists realized that there was a message behind it because of the people who were in the stands and who were blowing up the records, and the records that they chose. So Gloria Gaynor thought that it was, just crass and destroying a genre of music for one night of boosted ticket sales. But Nile Rodgers called it a Nazi book burning. And a lot has been written since then about this degree of racism and homophobia, because the records that were selected weren't necessarily disco. You'd sift through the pieces on the field, and this isn't a disco record, this is a soul record. What's that about? Well, I think we kind of understand what that's about. And
then Anita Bryant makes an appearance in your book, and it's fascinating how really her activism in reading your piece backfires, really, in that you write that it electrified the queer civil rights movement. Explain that.
I think it backfired for her personally, but as a harbinger of this counter-revolution to come, it wasn't a backfire at all. It was the warning shot, right? Her career afterward took about 1.5 years before she lost her spokesperson job with the Florida Orange Juice Commission. We talked about this a little last night. Historians have written about this direct translation of people who were fighting school desegregation in Florida, and when they lost in court, they immediately transferred their energies to this Save Our Children movement that Anita Bryant anointed herself the spokesperson for. And she wanted to be the vice president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So at the Southern Baptist Convention in Atlanta in 1978, she gave this 30-minute sort of lounge act speech performance that was all about, the people outside are the problem, we're not the problem. 20,000 Baptists inside listening to her, and not every Baptist believed or adhered to what she was saying at all. And in fact, she didn't win the election that she wanted to win for vice president of it. But what happened is everyone who knew about it, they moved up Pride that year so that they could protest Anita Bryant. And that was a catalyzing effect. And it drew in a lot of straight people and allies and people on the entire gender spectrum to come and join the protest. And from then on, Pride established itself on a different level. And within a few years after that, people in the thousands. And for a long time, it also kept Pride connected as a protest, where it was starting to turn into block party. And that's kind of the modern iteration of pride, right? There's the subtle theme of protest and standing up for your rights, but then there's 300,000 people sweating it out in Piedmont Park. She definitely had a role in all that, but to this day, she believes that she was a martyr.
Last night you were telling me about how the city of Atlanta looks when you're approaching it from Interstate 20 from the west, heading east. The Wizard of Oz makes an appearance several times in your book. Can you elaborate on that point?
Yeah, and that was one where I got the theory straight in my head before it outwardly expressed itself, and then there were just a bunch of coincidences. I realized early on that I was writing an anti-fairy tale. From a drag performer being the Cinderella in the story, to all the friends that she made along the way, or being the Dorothy of the story, sorry. And then I started to look around, and there were just these references that kept cropping up. They performed The Wizard of Oz at the Sweet Gum Head several times, and at other drag clubs when the other clubs realized how well they had done it. Bill Smith mentioned in a column that he wrote in the Barb that The Wizard of Oz was on in the background when he signed the paperwork to take over the Barb and become its owner, publisher, and editor. So I rifled through like old television records to find out when CBS would have broadcast it. So I'm like, all right, March 30th. I know what time, where it happened. But I kept going back to this idea that it was an anti-fairy tale, and it kept reinforcing it. This is, there's no happy ending here. And these characters are coming to find themselves, and some do and some don't, and it doesn't resolve neatly. But the thing that always stuck with me is that view of Atlanta that I had experienced myself driving in from west of town on I-20. When you pass the sign for Lithia Springs, all of a sudden there's the city. There's a tree canopy and glimmering lights above it, and all I could get into my head and get nothing else out of it was that picture when they're approaching Oz, and sometimes the illustrations on the print copies of The Wizard of Oz had that same view of Oz off in the distance. And Atlanta looks like that, or at least it looked like that to me.
One of my favorite parts of the book is this very sweet and tender relationship between Diane Hughes and Bill Smith. And I'm interested to hear about how they stuck together for so long and made their relationship work amid all the tension around them.
To me, it was a real process of discovery. Once he decided to be out to her first and other people, it was, what kind of relationship do we have? And she was very frank in describing how they got to the point where it was more like brother and sister, and they were mutually supportive. And the thing that always got to me that we never spoke directly about, but may now, that Bill had resisted going to therapy to try and address his emotional issues. And Diane became a therapist, and she saw him through the last stages of his life, and still very emotional because I just have this empathy for what he must have been going through in the last days of his life, thinking that there was no solution to all the problems that had accumulated, and all these people reaching out to help him and not being able to, and still being rejected by his family. You think it doesn't happen now, but yeah, you still see all these shock therapy treatments are still legal in some states, and there's still people who are going through that.
This is a geeky writer question, but I have to ask it. One of my mentors, he came and spoke to us at the MFA program, Hank Klibanoff, who hired me at the paper. He maintains that the reporting for a story is more important than the writing because you can't write what you don't have. So I'm interested to hear you tell us a little bit about the reporting for the book, how you gathered down all the sources of the information. I understand you went as far away as tracking somebody down in Japan, that you dug through copies of the Barb, of course, at the Atlanta History Center, and you got access to some of Bill Smith's letters through Diane. Can you talk about the reporting?
Yeah, because I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. It was a very stop-start process, digging everywhere I could, finding bits and scraps of paper, and firing random text messages to strangers because I'd found their telephone numbers on the internet, and they had the name of the person I was trying to track down. And it was that particular point turned out to be important, but ultimately for me, it was one of the big challenges of reporting. I'd found Bill Smith's living niece, who was stationed in Japan with her husband, and she hadn't been informed about the facts of his life. So we had a long, hour-long conversation, 5 a.m. her time, 5 p.m. my time. And there was one detail that she gave to me that just still sticks with my head. The only physical memory that the family has, their house burned down, of course, was a pile of coins that he had collected as a kid, and they had all melted together. And that's the only way she knows her uncle. So I had other tangential things. I drove to Cornell because they have the National Gay Task Force archives, and they had a couple of handwritten letters from him. And of course, the Atlanta History Center and Georgia State have just great collections to just dig and find critical details and ancillary details at the same time. It's hard to tell what you're looking for at first, so you got to take pictures of everything, but I would go through long periods of just trying to find everything else out that I could, and then kind of pull back, write some, go back out.
We have just a few minutes. I have a couple more questions left, Marty. I'm interested in, we mentioned this last night when we were having dinner, it was about this idea of serendipity and how it plays a role in your reporting. Hank has been a proponent of this too, is how things just sort of happen and you're lucky to be there and to find them. What was written, I think, would you say it was on the wall of your apartment? When
I can't remember what it was, the exact thing. I had bought this condo at Cheshire Bridge next door to the building Sri Gumhead is, and someone had, before the condo was renovated, somebody had written something in marker on the wall, and it's like, you know, your future is only a step away. This was like 1997 or 98. Had nothing to do with what I would eventually write, but it was just one of those things along the way that now I look at it, it's like, oh, that was a big old sign. You know, you should have recognized that one coming along. But the other things that just reinforce you along the way when you speak to people and they say, you know, the reporting thing where if people are saying the same thing to you from multiple places and multiple points of view, then you're kind of on the right track. To me, that's the key. You know where you're going, and then the big things that, you know, nature tries to strike you over the head with, they work in concert with that.
Now, I wanted to ask if you're comfortable talking about what you're working on next, and I understand there's some good things happening right now in your career. I'm really excited for you.
Yeah, I'm hoping to, a couple of things going on. I do have this fantasy about turning this book into a jukebox disco musical. So if anybody is involved in the theater, Actors Express or Alliance, I mean, I want to make it happen. And I think the world is just about ready to start contemplating what happens in a theater. So I've actually written the first act of it, and I've been working with a local playwrights group to try and see if I have any skill in doing that. But the thing that is more directly related to book writing is Norton is going to publish my next book, and that is going to be about the life of Michael Hardwick, who was in the Bowers versus Hardwick case in 1986, and is always kind of reduced to being the person who lost and the person who was telling us we should have the right to have gay sex in the Supreme Court. But he was an artist and a loved member of the community and an activist, and he died of AIDS in 1991, and nobody's ever told his story and told of how he decided that he would let his life become a proxy for the gay rights movement at the peak of the AIDS epidemic. So I've started to research that and have met with his family a couple of times and starting to assemble that vast mountain of information that you have to start on a project like that. And hopefully 2 years from now, that'll be out.
Congratulations. I want to remind everyone that Marty's book is here for sale, and I believe you will be autographing copies. I'm so excited for your success. Congratulations. Great to see you. We're grateful for your time.
Thanks, Sue. Thank you.